Are you a diehard NBA fan that wants to stay up to date on news around the league but doesn't have time to watch all of the games? If so, this is the show for you. Let's run the break.
From half court to the 50-yard line, Jeff Pratt covers all things Hail Marys and hoops with expert guests, in-depth analysis, and scorching hot takes, bringing you closer to the action than a front row seat. Follow along on Twitter at Hotline Fantasy because the grind never stops on Hail Marys and hoops.
Welcome back to Run the Break. I'm your host, Jeff Pratt. I'm a social and content intern at DraftKings and a fantasy analyst at Primetime Sports Talk. Today, we've got a very special episode for you. I'm joined by Abby Chin, as you can see right here on the screen, Celtics reporter and host for NBC Sports Boston. Abby, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join me. Are you ready to talk about this team?
Thank you for having me. And yes, I wish we were talking after a win instead of a loss, but happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining me. You know, it's been an up and down start for the Celtics this season, but they appear to have somewhat righted the ship to an extent. Obviously, last night's game against the Lakers didn't go as we would have hoped. We're going to start with a positive aspect about this team. Which player has impressed you the most so far this year?
This season, I think up until this point, I would say Rob Williams. I think that there's no question that the franchise put their faith in Rob, giving him that contract over the summer. But he has stepped up into that larger role and largely been something aside from a couple of injury issues. And as of late, that's the only reason that I hesitate at all. As of late, he's gotten into some foul trouble and had a rough game against the Lakers last night as well. But he has been a huge part of why they have been able to get their defense back on track. And then you look at it offensively, and it's just so fun to watch him play and how high he can get above the rim. And I have sat through so many seasons where alley-oops were just not a thing that the Celtics did. And so now that has become a part of their offensive repertoire, it's a lot more entertaining to watch. And it's an effective weapon for the Celtics offense that is still trying to, like you said, find some consistency.
Yeah, the franchise definitely put a lot of trust in Rob, as you were saying, when they gave him a long-term extension this year. Honestly, I mean, I don't know how you feel about the contract. I know the guy you work with, Forsberg, the biggest Rob Williams fan out there, and I'm sure he was ecstatic about it too. I felt like the average yearly number could have been a little higher compared to what we think his ceiling could be, definitely driven down by, as you mentioned, the injury history. Obviously, he's had problems staying on the floor, besides a little bit of a fluke this year, dealing with a little bit of a knee issue. He has managed to handle that increase in minutes. So hopefully, it looks like it's trending in the right direction for Rob.
And it's a huge increase in minutes. I mean, doubling his minutes for a big guy, that is a much larger load for his body. So I remember we talked to him recently and he just said, I'm getting all the treatment, all the maintenance, all of it. I am doing everything I can. And he has been able to handle that increased load. So it's been good to see. I'm excited for Chris. He's one of my good friends and he's hyped. So yeah, you will not find any Rob Williams slander from us.
Awesome. Sounds great. Fingers crossed that he's able to keep progressing and staying healthy throughout the year. I'm going to move on. Now that we touched on a positive aspect, have to touch on a negative aspect here. Unfortunately, the Celtics need Jaylen Brown to be an elite second option in order to contend. We think he's capable of being that guy. We've seen flashes of him looking like he's able to be that guy, but he's been hampered by injuries throughout his career, and especially this season, whether it's a hammy pull, some knee issues, tendonitis. How confident are you in his long-term ability to stay healthy and be that number two guy?
Very confident.
Okay.
Yes, I know that this hamstring thing that he has been held out of half the Celtics games, and it's a touchy injury because it's something that he has experienced before. It's also an injury that you don't want to rush back. And I do think there was a little bit of that in his first game back initially with the hamstring. He said he felt tightness as soon as he touched the floor. And so I understand why they are being cautious with him. But like you said, he is a huge part of this team. He is one of the two pillars that we heard all summer from Brad Stevens and Ime Udoka, that this entire franchise is about lifting up those two guys. So the thing that I love about Jaylen is that every season he comes back improved, and not just in small areas or one little parts of his games. It's marked and it's obvious. And even when we were coming out of the bubble season and the off season was severely shortened, Jaylen came in with better ball handling skills and blew everyone away. And so I think that there's no question those two young guys for the Celtics, and Jaylen and Jason, their games are continuing to evolve. But what I have learned in covering them for their entire careers here in Boston is to never underestimate those two. And I have great belief that they will both continue to ascend and are two guys that you can rely upon for the Celtics and in the NBA in the near future.
Yeah, so it seems like the entirety of the Celtics fan base is kind of split down the middle. On one side, we've got the people who believe that Tatum and Brown can be the pillars for this team. You can have two elite wings. You don't need a superstar big. You don't need a superstar point guard. Obviously, they experienced that with the Kyrie Irvings, the Isaiah Thomases, the Kemba Walkers. Now we've moved on to a little bit more of a stable option in Marcus Smart, where he's not going to give you 25 points a night, but you know where you're getting, especially on the defensive end. And then on the other side, you've got the people who are begging Brad Stevens to blow it up, more of the overreactioners, which isn't really a term, but I guess I'll call it that. So you'd say you're firmly planted in the Tatum and Brown can be the pillars of this team for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. And you look across the league, I mean, how many other teams would want to be in the Celtics position and building around these two young guys who have experienced almost everything there is to experience in the NBA, and have that experience and continue to improve their games. I mean, I do feel like they're only going to get better. They're only going to step up as leaders more than we have seen. And I also believe that the competitiveness and the want to is there. So I do think they're going to figure it out. And I think that for those, what did you call them? Overreactioners?
The overreactioners, sure.
What are your options? What are you going to do? Is Bradley Beal really the piece that's going to bring a championship, bring us to banner number 18? How are you going to get him? What do you have to give up to get him? I think that's, you have to consider all of those factors before you start calling to blow up the franchise.
I completely agree. And, you know, there's paths to bringing in another guy that don't involve trading Jaylen Brown. Obviously, Bradley Beal's the guy. People want him. He's Tatum's best friend from home back in St. Louis. But, you know, the guy's going to be 30 soon. We've had our fair share of players who, once they've crossed the 30 threshold, they have not necessarily been themselves or who they've been throughout their career here in Boston in recent years. You know, there's some whispers of potentially Zach LaVine, et cetera, but I'm with you completely. I think that Jaylen Brown, he can be this guy. You just got to stay healthy. And I'm glad that they didn't keep rolling him out there when he was clearly hobbling with a hamstring injury. Just let him rest, let him get healthy. I think that was the right decision.
Yeah, it's the regular season. And that's what both Jaylen and Ime have maintained. I mean, if this was the playoffs, if these were must-win games, he could be out there, but there's no reason to rush him back right now.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into our next topic. You mentioned Ime, obviously new head coach in Boston. We're a little over 1/4 of the way into his first season as a head coach. What has been your impression of Ime Udoka so far?
The thing with me is that Brad Stevens was the only coach that I knew. I came in, my first year on the sidelines was Brad Stevens' first year in the NBA. And so I worked with him for 8 seasons, and it's so funny. I saw him in the stands recently, and I was just like, Brad, I miss you. I used to talk to you 3 times a day, and now, you know, I never see you. And so it is very different. It's different for me. But my early impressions of Ime are that the players love him and really do respect him and believe in the things that he's telling them. And while we have talked a lot this season about how old habits and just how hard they are to break, and I think we all can, you know, understand that. And so I do think the guys, the players want to play well for Ime. It's just a matter of figuring that out. It's a lot of change. I mean, I bring up Brad Stevens because it's a lot of change for me, and it's just something, and I'm on the periphery to be in there for Jaylen and Jason. Brad Stevens and that staff were all that he knew, were all that they know. And Jaylen, his assistant Tony Dobbins was retained, but for Jason, he's working with a new player development coach. He's got new staff. I mean, and then to have a new head coach who he is familiar with and has experience with, but it's so much change. And I think even myself, I underestimated what that is, how much change that is for people. And so looking back on it now, I'm not surprised at how rough the start of the season was. And I do think that we are seeing positive signs towards change and growth, and seeing that Ime's ideas are, once the players understand and are able to execute them, are working. I mean, you look at the switch everything defense, and how throughout the preseason, it was more so of just like immersion therapy. We were switching everything to get used to it. And it was so interesting to talk to Josh Richardson, who said, like, I take pride in guarding my yard. And so this switch everything is really, it's messing with my mind. And so it did take that to have to figure out, to learn, train your body to do it, to do things that way. And then you can kind of adjust backwards. And so I think that everyone is learning on the fly. And I do think that it's going to take some time. And this is not a word that is in, Boston sports fans vernaculars, but I think patience is due.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people who aren't necessarily happy with what they've seen from Ime so far this year don't realize, as you were saying, how hard it is to come into a new system, bring in an entirely new cast of not head coaches, assistant coaches, and training staff, et cetera, and then implement your system here. And it took him just a few games to bring this team up to where he wants them to be defensively. Now, every night they're not showing. Obviously, they got battered by the Lakers last night, especially on the inside. That was a tough one to see. But for the most part, when everyone's healthy, this is one of the best defensive teams in the NBA. And that's what we knew we were getting from Ime Udoka. He was a notoriously defensive guy. So is the offense going to struggle sometimes? Yes, especially when Jaylen Brown's out of the rotation. As you said earlier, he's missed half the games this season. So at risk of triggering some Celtics fans here, trust the process. Good. And patience is a better word there, but I completely agree, is definitely the mindset that these fans need to have. And, you mentioned Brad Stevens. We're going to segue away from Ime Udoka now, focus on Brad. He's obviously in his first year as the GM of this team. In your opinion, can this Celtics team, as it's currently constructed, actually contend in the East with everyone healthy? And if not, what moves do you think Brad Stevens needs to make to change that? And is it possible this year?
I mean, I think we're seeing, I don't think that they are one of the top 3 teams in the East, maybe 4 if you throw Miami in there, although the Celtics played Miami really well in Miami. No, I definitely think that moves need to be made. What in particular that is and what's missing, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that health is going to be a big factor, as it always is in the NBA. And Rob staying healthy, Al Horford staying healthy at 35 years old. I think that it's been really fun to see Grant Williams make the leap that he's made. But I do feel like something is missing. And whether that's just to be able to compete and defend with those top tier teams. We saw the Nets come in and what Kevin Durant did. And then LeBron James, that's what was different about the Lakers team that the Celtics saw versus the first time, is LeBron was a very different player. That first time, that matchup in Boston, he was just coming back off of the ab injury and was not nearly as aggressive as he was in that last game. So you're right, there is something missing. But as far as like a major change and a major move, I think what we all were hoping for is that Jason and Jaylen make enough of a leap that does get them into contention. We just haven't seen that yet. So at the risk of standing on the fence, I do not think that this team as constituted is going to compete for a championship, but I'm not sure what the move is. And I don't necessarily see major flaws or holes in the current roster makeup.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. You got guys who can do a little bit of everything. And you mentioned Grant Williams, obviously taking huge strides this year. We have the final crew of Danny Ainge's young players coming in. You got Grant, Romeo, Neesmith, Pritchard, Rob to an extent, but he's taken his game to another level here. I think that you're right. There's not a clear move the Celtics can make other than just hoping that these guys are able to step up like Grant Williams has this year and fill a role that they hadn't been able to fill before. Speaking of the young guys, out of that crew I mentioned quickly, who's your favorite? Who you think is the most promising long-term prospect for the Celtics?
That's tough.
That's
I have
tough.
really enjoyed, you mentioned Grant. I've really enjoyed Romeo, and Brad Stevens used to say it the way he said, he just has such a great feel for the game. When he's on the floor, he makes the right play, but he is another person who has a lengthy injury history and has had some trouble staying on the floor and fine. And then because you can't do that, you can't get those live game reps. And so you can't get a rhythm going. And so I would like to see what Romeo is capable of if he can get some consistent run. Of course, I have high hopes. I mean, for all of Chris Forsberg's love of Rob Williams, I am on the Aaron Neesmith hype train.
Mm-hmm.
If he can, just the energy that he plays with, like he jumping for rebounds, it's like he's shot out of a cannon and he just leaps across the court. Like, where did Aaron come from? What just happened? So he's so fun to watch. And his challenge is going to be able to hit shots coming off the bench cold and being able to fill that role for the Celtics, and for Ime Udoka to know that he can trust him in those situations. And we haven't seen it yet. I'm hopeful for that. I believe he's in it. He works hard. Everyone talks about just how much time he spends in the gym. And so I'm hopeful for an Aaron Neesmith. I think that would be huge for this team if they can add some shooting on the floor, especially coming off the bench with that reserve unit. So it's hard to choose between the young guys. Like that's why Danny's job was so hard. That's why Brad is in this role, and why I am glad that I am not. I don't have to be.
That's fair. I think that, as you mentioned, all of them do a little bit of different things, right? I've been really impressed by Romeo this year. I think that you got a bunch of guys on this team, Marcus Smart, Romeo Langford, who, if you're just watching the box score of this game, you won't be able to see their impact on this team, just because what they do, especially on the defensive end and hustle wise. And then Neesmith is definitely another one of those guys. He does not care. He will sacrifice his body and do whatever he needs to do. We're going to step away from my interview with Abby Chin just for 1 minute to talk about the sponsor for today's video, Calm. When it comes to athletes, we tend to focus on physical fitness, but there's another side to the game that's just as important: mental fitness. Calm, the #1 app for sleep and meditation, has teamed up with LeBron James, an athlete that my guest Abby Chin is very familiar with, having covered the Boston Celtics for years now, to help you train your mind and become the champion version of yourself. LeBron and Calm know that your mind is like any other muscle in your body, but you don't have to be a world champion to learn how to train it. Calm can help you train your brain so you sleep better, reduce your stress, and perform at your best, just like King James, especially when he's playing the Celtics. For LeBron, sleep is a critical part of his mental fitness routine. As he says, getting good sleep and finding time to rest is one of the most valuable things I can do for my body and mind. From the sound of rain falling on leaves to bedtime sleep stories, Calm puts me to sleep within minutes, which means I wake up ready for any challenge. So, if you head to calm.com/garden, for a limited time, you'll get 40% off a Calm premium subscription. With Calm, you have access to the nature scenes LeBron loves, like rain on leaves, and so much more, like sleep stories and meditations, so you can be ready for any challenges that life throws your way. Again, for a limited time, our listeners can join LeBron in using Calm and get a 40% discount on a Calm premium subscription at calm.com/garden. Unlock content to help you focus, ease stress, and sleep better. Get started at calm.com/garden. Again, that's calm.com/garden. Now, let's get back to the interview with Abby and ask her one final question. Awesome. Well, Abby, I've only got one more question for you here. It's much more of a fun one. We're going to wrap things up on a lighter note. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me once again. Who is the best current Celtic to interview? I'm going to put you on the spot there.
That one's easy. No, that's not on the spot at all. It's Marcus Smart.
Okay.
He's always been very generous with his time, first of all. So he typically says yes. And with Marcus, you never know what he's going to say. So that was my answer up until this season. And then Marcus got himself into a little bit of trouble, as we know, that first week or so. And so he's been a little bit more closed off, a little bit more filtered this year. I'm hoping that eventually that opens up and we get back to the Marcus that we all know and love, because I feel like that passion is what makes him who he is. There's no question. Marcus wears his heart on his sleeve, and that's why he's so fun to talk to. And so he has been a little bit more closed off, but I'm hopeful that we get the old Marcus back sooner than later.
Awesome. Abby, thank you so much for joining me once again. For those of you watching, you can find her on Twitter at TV Abby. And if you tune into NBC Sports Boston anytime on a Celtics game day, there's a good chance you're going to see her hosting the pregame show, postgame show, on the sidelines. She does it all. Abby, thank you so much once again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. For all of you guys watching, I will check in with you later at the end of this show. Have a good one, and let's run the break. Welcome to the first edition of Pratt's Prognosis, a segment where I take a look at underperforming teams around the NBA, diagnose what's going on, and what potentially could be the solution. Sticking with our theme of the episode, since I am talking with NBC Sports Boston reporter Abby Chin, we're going to be breaking down the Boston Celtics. And this team is really struggling, and honestly, I've got a lot of notes on them because there are tons of problems going on with the Celtics right now. First and foremost, defense. The Celtics trailed by 20 in just 3 of their first 24 games this season. It has now happened 3 times in a row at the time I'm recording this episode. Consistent defensive lapses, missed rotations, and just a general lack of effort, especially on the defensive glass, is leading to just complete defensive meltdown as of late, which is really disappointing under coach Ime Udoka, who was brought in to be this defensive mastermind. We saw him implement that system early in the season, and it was working really well. The Celtics had one of the best defenses in the league for a stretch, but now they're really struggling again, and we'll see if they're able to turn it around. We know they've got the pieces to do so, but it's all about effort. Moving on to the next problem with the Celtics, it's turnovers. They're averaging 16.3 per game over their last 3 contests. That's just not going to get it done. They've got a bunch of guys who are really loose with the ball. It starts with their superstar, Jason Tatum, who, as excellent as he is, we know that he's prone to turnovers. And then you look at the other guys handling the ball. Jaylen Brown, while he has expanded on his handle this year, that leads to him being reckless at times. That being said, he's not on the court that much to turn it over. But then you look to other guys. Marcus Smart, we know how loose he is with the ball. He really just goes out there, slings passes, doesn't make the smartest decisions, and then coming off the bench and running the second unit, Dennis Schroeder, his turnover problems are very well documented. So when you've got a bunch of stars or key players on your team that are turning the ball over, it's hard to build momentum on offense. Moving on, as I mentioned in my last segment, injuries and illness. Jaylen Brown, he's missed half of the season with knee tendonitis, and then as of late, a pretty bad hamstring strain, which they rushed him back from and probably extended that absence, making it worse. There's almost always someone else out of the lineup too, besides Jaylen, whether it's Josh Richardson, who's now entered COVID protocols, but he was also dealing with a variety of illnesses such as the flu, Al Horford, rest days, etc. He's just an old man at this point. Rob Williams dealt with some knee issues earlier in the season. Hopefully, that's not going to plague him moving forward. Romeo Langford, he's always in and out of the lineup. We love Romeo, but he's dealt with a lot of ticky-tack injuries throughout the year. And finally, the biggest issue with the Boston Celtics is a lack of shooting. Or I'm not sure about biggest, but it's one of the biggest. The Celtics ranked 23rd in the league at 33.2% behind the arc. They have multiple key players that just can't hit the 3 consistently. It starts with Marcus Smart. He's just not a 3-point shooter, but he's got the confidence of an elite 3-point shooter, which is never good when you got your point guard taking shots like that they're just not capable of hitting. Dennis Schroeder hasn't been horrible this year behind the arc, but he's just not a consistent guy. Josh Richardson, we know he's much more of an intermediate game shooter, really good finishing at the rim, got a really good mid-range game, but he cannot shoot consistently behind the arc. And then you got a starting center in Rob Williams, who just isn't willing to take the shot. So that's fine, but you got multiple key players. That's 4 that just can't hit the 3 consistently, and they are key players in your rotation this year. So this Celtics team, constructed by Brad Stevens, they've got players that can establish a really good defensive presence, but they just can't get it done on offense. So we'll see what Stevens does with a trade deadline coming up to improve this team. They've got the trade exception from their trade of Evan Fournier this offseason to work with, around $17 million. They've got players that are coming off extensions that can now be traded. Marcus Smart, Robert Williams. There are a bunch of potential moves that the Celtics can make. First and foremost, they need to bring in a shooter. And secondly, they need to find a way to shake up this team because it's just not working as currently constructed. It's been a disappointing roster for a few years now, and we're clearly coming down to, you've got a core three, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and then Marcus Smart is included in there because he's the longest tenured Celtic. One of them's got to go, and it's not going to be Jason Tatum. So Jaylen or Marcus Smart, in my opinion, one of them has to go before things change, and that is Pratt's prognosis. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Run the Break. As always, I'm your host, Jeff Pratt. You can find me on Twitter at Hotline Fantasy to make sure you never miss an episode. We're going to be trying to bring Run the Break to you twice a week moving forward so you never miss out on any relevant news going around the association. Enjoy the rest of your week, enjoy the games, and I'll see you next time on Run the Break.